A very good evening to everyone joining us from home. This is the Hot Seat and I'm Jamal Ratnayaka. Today we are joined by a special guest. He is none other than Professor Sri Hettige of the Colombo University. A very good evening to you, Professor.
Very good evening.
So, Professor, now my first question to you would be, Sri Lanka is facing a series of crises. It's not just one crisis, a series. Now, the economic downturn along the lines of the rupee depreciating against the American dollar hitting an all-time low, then natural disasters, several top officials being accused of corruption, and there are so many other issues that Sri Lanka is facing right now, and the people are the ones who will eventually have to bear the brunt of these issues in the future and at present as well. And people in the parliament or political parties seem to be playing the blame game, Professor. The officials of the previous government seem to be throwing the ball onto the court of the current government, and the current government saying that the debt burden is increasing and various issues are arising because of the misdealings and the wrongdoings of the previous government. Why is this happening, Professor? Don't you think that the country or the main place that should be making these decisions on behalf of the country and taking the country forward has simply lost its way? They are simply not cooperating at all. Is this how the country can move forward together?
Yes, I think what you said at the beginning is quite correct. We are faced with a wide range of problems in the country which are interconnected. And these issues that we are talking about today, that you mentioned some of them, did not fall from the heavens. They have evolved over a period of time. In other words, it's very easy for people to talk about the problems here and now, as if there is no history to it, there's no background to it. But in fact, if you really look at each one of the issues that you mentioned, have a history, and they have evolved over a long period of time. And of course, when do you want to draw the line in terms of the period? It's of course possible depending on how you want to do that. But I think quite apart from the present day issues that you just touched on, we also have to look at the long-term issues and also wider issues that we have to cope with. I mean, we all know in the rest of the world that there have been many discussions and debates about much bigger issues like climate change, sustainable development, and the intensifying natural disasters. Now, these actually are far more important from a long-term sustainability point of view, long-term point of view of the people in terms of their well-being, not only today but also in the years to come. So the point is that it is very important that we figure out how best we could deal with the present day problems while also keeping an eye on the larger and the long-term issues. In fact, the problem that you are talking about today are the result of I would say suboptimal management of economic and other issues in the country. These include economic, social, political, and even cultural. So the point is that we expect the powers that be, the governments that come into power, to really have a fairly rational approach to solving these problems. And they are, of course, you cannot really sometimes work only within government. You also have to work across the political divide, and you have situations where governments have to work with other political groups, based on some consensus on a set of national priorities and so on. I mean, we talk about patriotism. Patriotism has to go beyond your self-interest and your narrow party interest. Self-interest is basic, patriotism is basically to talk about the long-term and larger interests of the wider public, not being nationalist or being ethno-nationalist or whatever. It is important that you have a much broader perspective on society, economy, and so on.
So, Professor, along those lines, discussing about the current situation in the country, we see that many of the politicians they don't seem to be cooperating, and that leads to political instability in the country. And as we all know, one of the leading deciding factors of FDIs or foreign direct investments coming into the country, increasing investor confidence, one of the factors that determine investor confidence is political stability. And when opposing parties hold grudges and fight among each other, investor confidence goes down. And don't you think as a result of that, Sri Lanka is currently facing this economic downturn and we are facing this current economic crisis?
Well, I think it is really in the interest of everybody, in the interest of the wider public, to maintain a certain degree of political stability. I mean, it may not be that we can have a very, very stable political and social environment in the country given the problems that we are faced with. But there is the bottom line. That is, people who are, in charge of, let's say, the management of public affairs, those who are, saying that they are interested in public affairs have to sometimes find common ground, because, it is not possible for us to simply blame one group for all the problems that we are confronted with in the country, because we have had governments managing our affairs over a long period of time, and you cannot say it is always the incumbent government which is responsible for the problems in a country, because how about the previous governments? I mean, were they really managing everything in a perfect manner? They were all doing perfect, things, and they were taking very sound decisions, and all what they had done is so sound that they have no responsibility for what is going on today. So I think the point is that we have to figure out how to get everybody to agree on certain things when the situation is really volatile, because at the end of the day, if you are saying that you are interested in helping the people in the country to overcome their problems, then you have to make sure that you also contribute to political stability, because it is not possible for a government to concentrate on both the short term and the long term simultaneously, because sometimes you are compelled to concentrate on the problems that are current. But I think we need to really think about long term stability, and I think, as you rightly mentioned, long term investments are very, very critical, because in the past we had projects like Mahaveli development projects that was actually expected to take 30 years, but it was of course telescoped and it was reduced to 6 years, and but again 6 years is not a short period compared to what what is happening in the country today,
right now, yes.
Because we are living from moment to moment now. But of course it was possible for the government that came into power in 1977 to implement the Mahaveli project within a fairly short period of time. But the point is that at that time that was considered a long-term investment, and the long-term investment came. That was because at that time, immediately after 1977, we had a government with a very big majority, and people expected that government to maintain political stability in the country.
Yes. Professor, with that, we would like to cross over for a short commercial break. Stay with us. This is Hot Seat. Welcome back. This is the Hot Seat, and we are joined by Professor Sri Hettige. Professor, now as we were discussing earlier about investor confidence and political instability, you were saying that people needed to actually fall in line and make compromises in order to attract investors from other countries. Where do you stand on this? Do you think that the politicians are actually doing a good job in this? But it clearly doesn't seem like it, doesn't it?
No, I think the main problem is that investor confidence is very critical today, mainly because the investors these days are looking for opportunities for short-term gain. In other words, you don't have too many investors coming into the country for long-term investment. Like for instance, as I already mentioned, long-term irrigation and power projects like Mahaveli. But the point is that it is very important for us to recognize the fact that many investors today are interested in short-term projects. Like for instance, it may be a construction project which is completed within a few years, and then you move on to the next project in the country or somewhere else. And similarly, we have more and more people investing in short-term financial instruments like securities, government bonds, and also shares in private companies,
yes,
and also investing in let's say even financial institutions, yes, and so on and so forth. Now you see, now these are very sensitive areas of investment, and when there is political instability, you're not going to buy certain financial instruments which have a kind of long-term kind of gestation period. So,
yes,
so it is important that we maintain political stability, and that cannot be done by the government alone. No government can
do it alone.
So the point is that if the political leaders in the country in general, I'm not talking about the government, if they really mean what they say, that they are patriotic, that they are interested in the welfare of the people, they are interested in the future of the country and all these things, then they should be basically also sitting with the others and asking questions like, what can we do to build investor confidence in the country, because it is in the interest of the country,
yes,
that we do that. So it is not in the interest of a particular political party or a political group. So the point is that the people should also be able to understand why there is no political consensus on even the most critical issues. I think people should ask that question. Why do politicians always fight over short-term problems when they should also be talking about long-term perspectives on development, like for instance sustainable development, and then also of course how to really cope with this massive problem of climate change, which is real, which is really impacting on people in general, but also of course more specifically the vulnerable segments of the population. And then I think I also mentioned disasters. Disasters are getting more and more ferocious, and it is important that we get ourselves organized to reduce the risks involved, and then also to see how best we could really manage disaster situations with a view to making sure that disasters don't really destroy everything, disasters do not dislocate everything,
yes,
and so on.
So Professor, talking along the lines of sustainable development and natural disasters, we saw many conventions and many treaties, many accords being signed, the latest of which being the Paris Accord signed last year. And Sri Lanka is actually part of many of these conventions and accords, but our authorities don't seem to be giving enough care to these natural disasters that occur from time to time. Something that used to occur yearly has happened monthly. Now we saw torrential rains and downpours causing flooding, landslides and many other natural disasters affecting a lot of people in the country, and that eventually leads to the drop in the efficiency of the economy, because people can't get to work, people can't do their day-to-day jobs, and that leads to an inefficient economy as well. But apart from that, Professor, don't you think that people or the policymakers should pay more attention to preventing natural disasters before they happen, rather than solving them, or rather than finding resolutions when they happen? Because that is what seems to be happening, because disaster seems to happen and we forget about it until the next occurs.
Yes, certainly we have to get ourselves organized as a country, as a society, to face up to this massive challenge. I think the main problem is that we only talk about the disaster management center and maybe the tri-forces when it comes to disasters. But whereas in reality, it is important for us to have an intersectoral approach to disaster risk reduction. The point is that so many institutions are involved. If you really look at what we could do to reduce disaster risk.
Yes,
I mean, there are so many ministries involved,
yes,
so many government institutions involved, and then also we have to get the other sectors involved, like the private sector and so on and so forth. So the point is, how do we get ourselves organized? I think that is probably the biggest challenge. But I think it is important that we really come up with strategies that would help us to mobilize the resources coming under the purview of all these various ministries. I would say that we have to have a cluster of ministries and institutions working closely together to have a coordinated approach to dealing with disasters. And,
yes.
so, and I think it is also true for the other two areas that I just mentioned, the climate change and sustainable development. And we are talking about let's say not like let's say the Millennium Development Goals. When we were talking about several Millennium Development Goals, where we were talking about poverty reduction and so on. But whereas here we are talking about 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are very much interconnected, and together these Sustainable Development Goals demand us to have a social and economic transformation, not just reduce poverty, this, that and the other. How to really bring about a major transformation in the way we manage our resources, we manage our economic enterprises, how we manage our natural resources, and so on and so forth. So I think it is a big challenge, and I don't think that we have a discourse that transcends political division, which is very unfortunate. And I don't hear any of the opposition politicians, opposition political activists talking about these very big issues and three very big agreements that we have signed up.
Yes, now with that we cross over for another short commercial break. Stay tuned. This is the Hot Seat. Welcome back to the Hot Seat. We are joined by Professor Siri Hettige. Now, Professor, as we were talking along the lines of the economy of the country, now we know that Sri Lanka used to be a country that was heavily reliant on exports. We used to be an export-based economy, tea, rubber and several other industries, and they contributed a lot to our GDP and the revenues that we collected in the past years. But in recent years, we see that export-led growth, or the exports as a whole, have fallen. And do you think that if we had maintained such a level of exports up to now, we would be facing less of a crisis? Yes, we would be facing a crisis because the economy as a whole of the world is bad. But if we had sustained the level of exports that we used to have, do you think we could have lessened the impact the downturn could have had on our economy?
Well, I think here we are talking about the balance between exports and imports.
Yes.
You can only import if you export. So it is important for you to figure out how to increase exports in order to import more and more things that the people need. Now, I think the problem here is that there is an imbalance between imports and exports, and we have basically concentrated on a very few export items over the years, and as a result we have not been able to maintain a balance between imports and exports. And that is why we have this massive trade gap, running into over $9 billion US. Now the question is, how do you really maintain a balance? So you have to look at both what you are exporting and what you are importing, and whether there is there is room for us to really balance the two.
So to look at both ends of the
Absolutely.
spectrum.
Now, for instance, when you look at imports, we can see we spend a great deal of foreign currency to import intermediate goods, like machinery, fuel, raw materials, and so on and so forth. And here we can see a lot of industrial goods being involved, for instance the machinery, for instance. And then of course we also have concentrated more and more on the services sector in this country. We have massive construction projects going on, hoping that there will be big commercial enterprises coming up, housing projects, infrastructure projects, and so on and so forth. Now all these are also dependent heavily on imports. Imports means basically industrial imports. So I think the main problem is that we have really not made an effort to strike a balance between different sectors of the economy. For instance, the agricultural sector has to be vibrant so that we can really produce enough food, and also reduce the burden of importing a lot of the food items that we are importing today. And then of course industrial sector, as you know, is so critical, not only from the point of view of other sectors, requirements of other sectors, but also in terms of consumer demand for industrial goods. Like for instance, we import our transport sector, for instance, it's almost 100% dependent on imports. So we have to import all the transport equipment, and of course more transport equipment you import, more fuel we have to import, and so on. And then similarly, when you don't have industries producing household items, then again you have to sort of import and so on. So I think the problem is that we have failed to really maintain a balance between these three sectors. And then of course we have a situation where we have not been able to earn enough from our exports to pay for our imports. In fact, I already mentioned recently that we earn much less than what we really need to import what we import. That's about 52% of our trade deficit is very much due to the fact that we don't really earn enough export earnings. So and I think there we certainly have to increase export production, commodities for export. Otherwise what you end up is in a situation where you have to rely on other sources of foreign exchange. Like for instance, today we are dependent heavily on remittances sent by our workers. So and of course when you have dependence on remittances, you have a permanent burden because you have to really maintain the presence of a huge proportion of our labor force in other countries in order to finance our imports.
And that concludes tonight's edition of the Hot Seat. We were joined by Professor Sri Hettige. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your valuable thoughts and ideas on how we can get ourselves out and keep our head above the water in this during this hard time. And thank you very much for watching, and thank you for joining us on the Hot Seat. For the Newsfirst team, I am Jamal Ratnayaka. Good night.